head out to children's church. Guys, I got choked up there. No, you don't. As we're singing, I'm going to try to say this. Hold on. As we're singing there, I love to tell the story. I got overwhelmed, Miss Roxanne, when I saw you walk up to these little boys and just hug them. Y'all, that's how we tell the story. We tell the story through our love, through how we love others that we may not know, we may not fully know all. But in that moment, we reach out to those that are reaching for us. We love them. We share with them the hope and the life that Jesus gives. When a church does that, the gates of hell will not prevail against it. This morning, we're going to be in the book of Jonah. We're starting a study looking at the book of Jonah. I was reminded this week the importance of repetition. And so you're going to hear me saying certain things throughout the next several weeks as we look at the book of Jonah and as we study this. You're going to hear certain statements over and over and over again. And here's why. It's because the devil is a thief. Satan is a thief. And he wants nothing more than when I stand here before you and God's word is proclaimed and preached, Satan wants nothing more than before you get to your car today to steal that word that God has for you from your heart. And there may be 1,000 other things that he brings into your mind, 1,000 other thoughts of what must get done today, that what's approaching this next week. But what the enemy wants to do more than anything else is to steal the word of God from your heart today before you even fully get it rooted. And so you're going to hear me say certain truths, certain things that need to be repeated, that need to be remembered by us as the people of God. And so if you get nothing else out of this sermon today or out of this series this week, I want you to understand this fact, and you're going to hear it over and over and over again. Our God is a God who pursues sinners. Our God is a God that pursues sinners in the midst of their rebellion. Our God is a God who pursues sinners in the midst of their ignorance. Our God is a God who pursues sinners who are running from Him and who are standing in opposition to Him. Our God is a God who pursues sinners, and for that very reason is the reason why today I am saved. Because I was a sinner and am a sinner that has been saved by the grace and mercy of our God. Our God is a God who pursues sinners. This morning, as we look at Jonah chapter 1, you're going to see certain themes here in the text. Maybe you've heard this statement before, and if you have, I want you to finish it for me. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. That really could be kind of the subplot of the book of Jonah. Because when the going gets tough, what did Jonah do? He got going. When God began to ask him to do hard things, Jonah said, "Nope, God, that's too much for me. I'm out." And he began to head in a different direction. I'm afraid that sometimes we do the exact same thing when God asks us to do hard things. I'm afraid that there are times in our lives and within our churches and within the mission that God has called us to that sometimes we look at God and God places a vision and a desire on our heart, something that we might think, but when we hear it, our immediate thought is, God, that's hard. And in that moment, we allow the enemy to come and begin planting seeds of doubt and fear in our lives that squelch the passion and drive that God wants us to accomplish. Church, sometimes we have to understand this fact, and this is kind of the key point of this morning. Sometimes God is going to ask you to do hard things. How you respond when He does so will define who you become. And it will define your story. Think about this. When we think about Jonah, when we think about what Jonah was called to go and to do and to demonstrate, God is asking him to do something hard. Look what it says there in the beginning in verse 1 of Jonah chapter 1. It says, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, 'Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me.'" What we're going to do today is we're just going to kind of walk through this book, this first chapter of the book of Jonah. So if you need to, try to find that book there. It's there kind of wedged in between the small prophets after, or right there before the book of Matthew. But here in the first verse of the book, we see God asking Jonah to do something hard. He tells him, "Arise and go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me." You see, the question for us today becomes this: how will we respond when these hard things are placed in our paths? You see, make no mistake that what God is asking Jonah to do here requires a great deal of faith. It requires a lot of trust. It's hard. It could potentially cost him a lot, even his very life. And yet the question that Jonah is being forced to answer here and ask himself is, will I be obedient even in those hard things? Let me try to put in perspective what God has just asked Jonah to do. See, Nineveh was located in what is today Mosul, Iraq. The Ninevites were known for being a horrible people. They were brutal in a lot of their practices and in a lot of the deeds that they would do. They were known for cutting off the heads of the conquered people that they had gone up against and then placing them around the city walls. How's that for a welcome package when you come into town? Others they would then impale on long stakes while they were still alive, and they would hang their bodies around the city. So when we think that God called Jonah to go to Nineveh because their wickedness was before him, I want you to understand that Jonah being called to do this is not easy. It would be like him looking at you today and saying, "I want you to go to modern-day Iraq and find the leadership of ISIS and tell these people that God thinks you're evil and He's going to judge you for it." I mean, who's signing up for that mission trip? See, what God is doing here is He is calling Jonah to do something hard. I believe He still does the same to us today. I believe every single one of us will have times in our lives when God calls us away from the comfort that we would like to live towards the faithfulness that He is leading us to. And it always, I will say, comes at a cost. See, somewhere along the way, we've adopted this thought process that God only brings us good things, and anything that is otherwise, anything difficult or bad in my life must come from Satan, or it must come from somewhere else. But that is not what the Scriptures teach us. Isaiah 45 verse 7 tells us plainly, it says that I, God, form light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am the Lord who does all these things. We were talking about it in Sunday school this morning in our Life Together class, that there will be at times in your life that God intentionally brings difficulty and hardship and pain into your life And you may never fully understand all the reasons why He is doing it, other than that it exists for His glory. As you walk through those difficulties and those trials, one of the greatest examples that I have ever personally witnessed of this story, of this reality, took place in the life of a friend of ours from seminary's brother. His name, this is a great name. His name is Smooth Villa. That's his name. That's his name. Smooth. And his wife, Smooth and Kelly Villa. So Smooth and Kelly, they come from a great family, a missionary family. They have a lot of mission work that they do in Haiti and in Africa. And Smooth and Kelly have 3 daughters already. On a mission trip to Uganda, they came across this young little orphan girl named Chloe. And their hearts were just immediately bonded with Chloe. So much so that they just knew that God was telling them that I want you to adopt this little girl. And so as they got back from Uganda, they began the process, and it's a lengthy process, to get all the documentation in place and to get everything that needs to happen figured out and signed. And in this process, they just knew God was telling them that they were going to adopt this little girl named Chloe. So after that process and after continuing to do that, they think that they're just about ready to bring Chloe home to the United States. But when time came, they weren't allowed to do so. And so there they were in Uganda, thinking that they were going to be coming as a family of 5, coming home with a 6th. But they ended up having to leave their daughter, Chloe, there in Uganda. Her visa had not gone through. The paperwork in the United States wouldn't go through. And then it just increasingly became clear that this wasn't happening in the way that they thought it should happen. But they knew that God had called them to do this. They knew that God wanted them to adopt this little girl. And so it was in that moment that Smooth began to ask himself a question. He began to ask this: can God be for me while His hand is actively working against me? Is it possible that in the midst of feeling the very opposition that God is bringing in our lives, that God is actually working for His greatest glory in and through us? As he pondered that question, him and Kelly finally came to this conclusion: that if we can't bring Chloe home, we will bring home to Chloe. So him and his wife and their 3 biological daughters moved to Uganda to become missionaries and to adopt Chloe into their family. There are going to be times when God calls us to do hard things. And sometimes those hard things are going to require us to make hard decisions. And in that moment, we have to ask ourselves, will we be faithful to what God has called us to do? I want you to think about your life. Who are the hard people that God has put you near? You all know somebody. A neighbor, a coworker, a friend. But their hearts are hard to the things of God. Maybe they're not receptive to the gospel. Maybe you've tried to share with them in the past and they just simply didn't want to hear it. But God has put you in their path as an agent of Christ to shine the light of the gospel so that others might see. What are the hard things that God is calling you, even at this very moment, to do? Hard things with your money, hard things with your time, hard things with the people and places around you. And my question for us this morning is, how are you responding to those hard things? This morning we're going to see some examples from the life of Jonah. And we're going to see 3 different responses that people will often have when the going gets tough. When God asks them to do something hard and the life is not necessarily in the time of smoothness and comfort. In those moments when life gets hard, we're going to see this morning 3 different responses that people have to God. The first thing we're going to see this morning is that when the going gets tough, some will run from God's will for their lives. When the going gets tough, some will run from God's will for their lives. We see this with Jonah. God had told Jonah, Jonah, son of Amittai, pick up and go to Nineveh and proclaim to them that I'm going to judge them if they don't turn. And look at what Jonah does. But Jonah, verse 3, rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. You see, some people, when God asks them to do hard things, their response is to say, well, I'm not going to do that. And they run the other direction. To put it in another way, and this is the way that I want us to think about, what happens in our lives when God's direction comes into conflict with our desires? What happens in our lives when God is clearly leading us towards something, but it's in conflict with what I, in that moment, want to do? Do we surrender our heart and our life and our will to the direction that God has and has set for us? Or do we say, God, I must have misheard you. God, that surely can't be what you want me to do. Or maybe even like Jonah, we say, God, I'm not going to do that. But what happens when God's direction comes into conflict with our desires? The reality is that many will simply say to God, I know what your word says. I know that your word says I should be obedient, but ultimately, I'm going to do what I want to do. And this is what we see Jonah doing. When confronted with the task of going to Nineveh, he instead chooses to run. And he doesn't just run, he really runs. Look at this. I have a map here. So he is there in Israel at point A, if you see there on that map. That's where Jonah was located. And he's told to go to point B, which is Nineveh. Now, that's actually not a very long trip. It was just a few days' journey. But instead, Jonah hops on a ship, and he says, you know what? I'm going to go as far the other direction as I physically possibly know how to. And he begins to try to head to Tarshish, which is in modern-day Spain, all the way over to the far side of the map. It says there that he did this to get away from the presence of the Lord. So let's go back a little bit, okay? Let's go back to like Theology 101 that Jonah, as a prophet of God, surely had to have known, okay? So, Theology 101. God is omnipotent, meaning that God is all-knowing. That God knows everything that we think. He knows every place that we are. He knows every detail, both past and present and future. That God is all-knowing, supreme in His knowledge. Meaning there is nothing that we can do that takes God by surprise. But not only is God all-knowing, not only is God omnipotent, but God is also omnipresent, meaning that God is in all places. That there is literally nowhere that you could go to escape from the presence of God. That He is on the highest mountain and on the deepest ocean. No matter where you might go, God is there. And other prophets had stated this. Jeremiah 23 verse 24 says, "Can a man hide himself in hiding places so that I do not see him, declares the Lord? Do I not fill the heavens and the earth, declares the Lord?" Psalms 139 verse 7 through 10 says, "Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. And if I make my bed in Sheol," meaning the grave, "behold, you are there. And if I take the wings of the dawn, and if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will lay hold of me." Guess what that means? You ain't getting away from the presence of God. So why does Jonah in this moment think that he can escape from the presence of God? I only have two explanations for why in this moment Jonah thinks that. One is that sin will make you desperate. Sin will make you desperate. Sin will make you do things, say things, and act in ways that you never thought that you would act apart from sin. Some of you guys have experienced this. All of us, I think, have probably experienced this. That when your life is being ruled by sin and sin is reigning in your heart, you will do things and say things and act in ways that if you were in your right mind, you never would have acted or said. So sin will make you desperate. Secondly, sin will make you dumb. Sin will make you dumb. You will do dumb things when your heart is being ruled by sin. Romans chapter 1, verses 21 through 22 tells us that. Romans 1, 21 through 22 says, "For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools." Sin will make you dumb. Why else would a man leave his wife of many years for a fling of physical attraction? That's dumb. Sin will poison your heart and darken your eyes to the point that you will do things and say things and act in ways that are just insane. And I believe that's what we see here with Jonah. That Jonah's heart is so ruled by his fear, it's so fueled by focusing on himself and what he wants to do, that in this moment, he doesn't care who God is and what God's called him to do. The only thing that he sees and can think is, I need to go in the complete opposite direction. But understand this, church, that when we look at the entirety of the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, there is a key theme that we see, and it's the one that I've already told you that I'm going to be repeating to you. It's this fact, that we serve a God that pursues sinners. God does not allow sinners to just go in their own way unchecked. He doesn't allow them to just go and to flee from Him forever. But instead, God is perpetually pursuing even those that rebel against Him, even those that have hardened their hearts against Him. God is continually there, knocking, pursuing, waiting, longing for His people to return to Him. Ready, when they do so, to receive them back. Sinners run from God. And this is just a reality. We see this in Scripture. That sinners run from God. It's why one of the first things that someone does when usually they get caught up in sin is they do what? They isolate themselves from the people of God. One of the first things that people do, if they're feeling conviction over something that they're doing, or they're making some decisions that they know are not honoring to Christ, one of the first things they do is typically they isolate themselves from the people of God. Jonah does this. He runs from God, but look at the very next verse. Verse 4. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship was threatened to break up. You see, while sinners run from God, God always runs after sinners. While Jonah runs from God, God is right there behind him. Verse 5. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea in order to lighten it for them. See, they're so desperate here that they just all begin to cry out to their own gods, but none of it's working. They're calling out to their gods, and yet they're finding it is only reaching deaf ears. The storm is continuing to persist. Have you ever noticed that this happens? Have you ever noticed that usually when people get desperate, all of a sudden that's when they all of a sudden get very religious? When things are going wrong, when things aren't making sense. Like, I may never pray before, but when all of a sudden things get really, really bad, hey, God, I think it's because, we actually were talking about this in Sunday school as well. I think it's because that at times, when things are going well, we feel like we have some sense of control. Like maybe we are the ones that got us to that place where everything is going good, and so we feel like we're in control. But then all of a sudden when things start going bad, and I mean really bad, all of a sudden it reminds us what? We have no control. And so we reach out to God thinking, well, hopefully at least He's in control. And so we see this picture here that these mariners begin to cry out to any God that would listen. And then they hurl the cargo that was in the ship into the sea. Now, guys, understand, these are professional sailors. This is what they did for a living. They transported cargo from one place to the other. So if they are hurling cargo, if they are hurling their livelihood into the ocean, it means that this storm is so bad that they see it as the only way they could possibly survive is to throw the entire reason for making the trip overboard in the first place. That's how desperate they are. Now, in the midst of this scene of chaos and confusion and crying out, Jonah had gone down into the inner parts of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, "What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God, and perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish." And they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. See, in that day, just a brief side note here, casting lots was a way that they would use to determine the will of God. Now, God doesn't want us to do this today. We don't draw straws out of a hat today. Why? Because God has given us a better way to determine His will. How do we determine the will of God today? Through His and through prayer. Through His Word and through prayer. And so, it says there, then they said to him, "Tell us," because now they've discovered that Jonah is the problem. It says, then they said to him, "Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? And where do you come from? What is your country? And of what people are you?" And he said to them, "I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Now, let me ask you this. I kind of chuckled there. Because is this true? Is Jonah acting like he fears the Lord in this moment? No. Because if he did, he'd do what? Obey. Instead, he's disobeying. He's running in the complete opposite direction away from where God has told him to go. He may be saying it with his lips that I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. He may be giving him lip service, but with his life, he is relaying a completely different message. Jesus in Matthew chapter 12 says that you can know the ones that belong to God. That those who truly are who belong to God, who are in God's kingdom, that you can know them. And how will you know them? Because they will do the will of my Father. Jonah isn't being obedient. He isn't listening to God. God has asked him to do some hard things, and instead, Jonah is running away from God, and yet God is a God who pursues sinners. So look what he says. Then, verse 10, the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, What is this that you have done? For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. See, watch this. Because Jonah was disobedient and sinful to God's call, his sin has now impacted others. It's impacted the people in Nineveh because now they haven't heard the message of the gospel that should have been brought to them by this point. It's impacting the lives of these sailors and mariners because now they're in a storm that most likely they would not have been in otherwise, and they're being threatened and feeling death. They've lost their livelihood because they had to throw all the different goods that they were going to be bringing to Tarshish off the ship. Sin always has effects outside of yourself. You may think, oh, well, I'm not hurting anybody else. This is just about me. No, your sin always has effects to other people. It always reaches deeper and causes more damage than you fully understand in that moment. He goes on to say, then they said to him, what shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us? For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. And he said to them, pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will grow quiet for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you. See, understand this. It never ends well when you run from the will of God. It never ends well when you run from the will of God. Now, I want you to, I'm going to show you fairly quickly these last 2 points. So some, when they are approached with hard things that God has told them to do, some will simply deny it and they will try to run in the other direction. Some will try to row against God's will for their lives. Watch what the sailors try to do here. Verse 13. Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. See, this is also a hard thing that they've been asked to do, because they don't want to throw Jonah overboard. They don't want to see this man die because of them. So what they try to do is they try to get themselves out of that situation by their own efforts. They try to fix the situation through their own strength and through their own desires, through their own will. Instead of surrendering to God, they try to do enough on their own to save themselves. Do we not see this all the time with people who are going against God's plan and trying to trust in their own abilities? See, please understand that when we try to trust in our works, it never works. In fact, what we're going to see is it always makes things worse. It tells us there, for the sea, that as they continue to try to do this, as they continue to try to row against the storm, it says that the seas grew more and more tempestuous against them. When we try to operate in our own strength, when we try to save ourselves, it only makes matters worse. See, the reason why trusting in your own works is so devastating is because it nullifies grace. See, it's like God is trying to say, I want to give you this amazing gift. I want to bless you. I am pursuing you. And instead you say, God, it's okay. I've got this. When all he wants is for you to rely on him. You see, it's not about what we can do. It's about what God has done for us. So some will run from God's will. They will say, I don't want to do those hard things. Some will row against God's will. They will say, let me try to do this in my own strength. But there are some, and my prayer is that this describes us. Some will release their lives to God's will. He says there in verse 14, therefore, they called out to the Lord. See, this time, they're not calling out to their own individual gods like they were other in desperation. This time they intentionally call out to the Lord, the God. And the indication here seems to be that something has changed in them. Something has changed in their perspective. Some even have taught and believe that this is actually the point of their conversion. That now they're no longer crying out to other gods, but they are now calling out to the God. And they say here in this moment, O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood. For you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you. So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered up a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. Finally, this is the response that God has been looking for this entire time up to this point. This is the only response that works. He doesn't want us to keep running. He doesn't want us to keep justifying ourselves. Instead, He is looking for when people understand who He is, to simply come to Him, to fall at His feet and say, God, I give it all to You. You are the one worthy of worship. I can't keep doing this in my own strength because it doesn't work. I can't keep running away because it doesn't work. You keep pursuing me. And so, God, I give it to You because You are the one that is worthy. Finally, the saying is, Lord, I may not know what the future holds, but I know who holds the future. There's a lot of truth in that statement. You see, folks, this is not easy. But if you do this, if you seek to live in obedience, even in the hard things, you know what you will find out? You will find that God provides in amazing ways. As you seek to live lives of obedience, you will find that God continually blesses, and you may not even fully always know how God's blessing. I wish there was time for me to share with you the ways that me and Amanda have experienced. I got to share with it in Sunday school this morning some. I wish I could share all the ways that God has demonstrated His goodness in my story. Amanda, I've shared with you before, we got married and then immediately the next week moved 10 hours up to Wake Forest, North Carolina. Neither of us had ever lived away from home before. At the time that we moved, neither of us had a job. And yet God continued to provide for us. He provided places of employment. The great irony of the fact is that God is still blessing us through His provision even to today. After we moved back here to North Carolina for a season, Amanda worked for the academy, Seacoast Academy up here at Coastal Community. And just with life and different things that were going on, we started to realize, we need something else. And God just brought this opportunity into our laps where she could actually go back. The same company that she worked for 10 years before wanted her to come back and do the same job. God is still providing. From 10 years ago, God is still providing for us today. See, folks, when God tells us to do hard things, it doesn't mean it's going to be easy. It doesn't mean He's going to make the way straight, but it does mean this, that in that moment that we are obedient to Him, He promises that He will provide everything that we need. We see that in the story of Jonah, don't we? At the moment that he surrenders to God and they throw him overboard, what does God do? He calms the sea, and then watch what happens next. And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. He provided an Uber. He provided transportation. In the moment, sometimes God is going to ask you to do hard things. And it's going to require faith. Some of you here this morning, God is speaking to your heart. And you can feel God speaking to your heart. You can feel Him kind of pulling on it. Maybe you don't know Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and God has been trying to get a hold of you, and you keep running from Him. You keep trying to do it in your own strength. You keep saying, I got this. And God is saying, I am the God who pursues sinners, and I will continue to pursue you. Be obedient. Maybe some of you in here, God is laying on your heart something that He's telling you to start. Maybe it's a ministry or a Bible study or something that God is that there's a certain giftedness. We talked last week about the giftedness and the empowerment that God has on the lives of His people. Maybe God has empowered you for a certain ministry that only you have the ability to get started, and He's waiting for you to say, yes, stop running. I'm going to be willing to be obedient. point is this. Listen to what God is telling you. That conviction that he's placing in your heart, listen to what he says. And then instead of running, instead of trying to do it in your own strength, be willing and obedient enough to surrender to him and to say, okay, Lord, I don't know how this is fully going to work out. I don't know all the details. But God, I'm going to do what you've called me to do. If we as a church will do that, it goes back to what I said to begin with. The very gates of hell will not be able to stand against us. Let's pray this morning. Father God,